start with the night I stopped believing it was the wind. I was standing on the porch at almost 3 in the morning, and the dock down at the water had turned again. Not drifted, not shifted a few inches the way a loose board might after a storm. Turned. The whole structure was facing a completely different direction than it had 12 hours earlier, and the end of it, the very tip of it, was pointing straight at our back door. I remember my hands were cold even though it was the middle of July. I remember I didn't call out for Eric. I just stood there, looking at a wooden dock that had no motor, no hinges, nothing that could explain what I was looking at. And I thought very calmly that I had officially run out of reasons to pretend this was normal. That's where this story ends. I want to back up and tell you how we got there because none of it looked like this in the beginning. In the beginning, it looked like the best summer we'd had in years. We found the house in early June. It was a rental, one of those lake properties that gets listed for the season and then disappears again in September. And it was cheaper than it had any right to be for what it offered. 3 bedrooms, a screened-in porch that faced the water, and a private dock that the listing photos made look almost too perfect, like something out of a postcard. Eric found it first. He does this thing every spring where he gets restless, starts scrolling through cabins and lake houses at 11 at night, and usually nothing comes of it. This time, something did. We drove up on a Friday with the car packed the way you pack when you're trying to convince yourself you're going to relax for once. Cooler in the trunk, both our laptops because neither of us can fully disconnect from work, and this quiet kind of excitement that I hadn't felt in a long time. The lake itself was smaller than I expected, ringed with trees, with maybe 6 or 7 other houses spaced out along the shoreline, far enough apart that you could go a whole evening without seeing another human being. The kind of place where sound carries strangely over water. The house smelt like cedar and old sunscreen, the way rental places always do. And it had that slightly too curated feeling, like someone had staged it specifically for people like us. There was a guest book in the kitchen drawer, mostly filled with generic entries. Had a great time, kids loved the lake, would come back. I didn't think much of it at the time. I want you to remember that detail later because it matters. The dock came with the property, obviously, extending maybe 30 feet out into the water, old gray wood that had clearly been replaced board by board over the years rather than all at once. It had a small aluminum boat tied to it that we were told we could use, and the ladder bolted to the end for swimming. Eric loved it immediately. We worked in the mornings from the porch, swam in the afternoons, grilled dinner most nights, and watched the sun go down over water that barely moved. I got into a rhythm of walking down to the dock every morning with my coffee before Eric was even awake, just to sit on the edge of it with my feet in the water. It became this small, sacred routine. I looked forward to it more than I looked forward to almost anything else that summer. We were sitting at the kitchen table, him with his laptop open, me still in yesterday's clothes because I hadn't bothered changing before coffee. He glanced out the window toward the water and said, almost as an afterthought, that it was strange. He could have sworn the dock had been angled differently the day before. I looked out the window with him. The dock extended out toward the center of the lake, same as it always had, at least as far as I could tell. I told him he was imagining things. I said the light probably just looked different in the morning versus the evening, that perspective plays tricks on you near water, that he'd had 2 beers the night before and probably wasn't remembering it clearly. He laughed, agreed, and went back to his email. I want to be honest with you. At that exact moment, I believed every word I was saying. I had no reason not to. It would be 4 more days before I understood that Eric hadn't been wrong at all. Those 4 days passed the way most of our days had passed since we arrived. Nothing about them stood out at the time. I only think about them now because of what came after, and because I keep trying to remember if there were signs I missed, smaller versions of what was coming that I dismissed the same way I dismissed Eric's comment at the table. On the 5th morning, I walked down to the dock with my coffee the way I always did, and I stopped about 10 feet from the edge of the yard. The dock was facing the wrong way. I don't mean it looked different in the light. I mean the entire structure, which for over a week had extended straight out from our little strip of shoreline toward the center of the lake, was now angled hard to the left toward the tree line on the neighboring property. It wasn't a subtle shift. I stood there for a long time before I moved any closer. I want to explain why, because I think it's important. It wasn't fear yet, not really. It was that specific, quiet confusion you get when your brain tries to fit something into a category it doesn't belong in. I kept looking for the thing that would make it make sense. A support post that had come loose, a section that had detached and swung around on some kind of hinge I hadn't noticed before. There wasn't one. I walked all the way down and out onto the boards, and I checked every point where the dock connected to anything. The support posts were driven straight down into the lake bed, solid, the way they'd been the entire time we'd been there. There was no pivot point, no hinge, no mechanism by which 30 feet of assembled wood and metal could rotate almost 45 degrees overnight without something breaking, without, at minimum, leaving scrape marks or disturbed mud where the posts had shifted position. I checked the posts for exactly that, disturbed mud, something to suggest movement. There was nothing. The posts looked exactly the way they had the first day we arrived, like the dock itself had simply always been facing this new direction, and my memory was the thing that was wrong. A week apart. I went back up to the house and woke Eric up, which I almost never do because he needs his sleep more than I need company in the morning. I told him to come look at the dock. He was groggy, mildly annoyed, and then he stood next to me on the grass and went quiet in a way that told me he wasn't annoyed anymore. He asked me if I'd moved it. I told him that was insane, that neither of us could move a 30-foot dock even if we tried, let alone in our sleep without waking the other one up. He didn't argue with that. He just kept staring at it, and then he said something that I've replayed in my head more times than I can count since. He said, quietly, that this was the direction he remembered it facing that first morning he'd mentioned it. Not a new direction. The same one. I didn't want to think about what that meant yet. At the time, I told myself it just meant his memory was better than mine, that maybe the dock had shifted back to some original position it had been trying to return to. I didn't examine that thought too closely because if I had, I would have had to ask myself why a fixed, structurally sound dock would have a position it was trying to return to at all. We talked about calling the property management company that handled the rental, and then we didn't, mostly because neither of us knew how to phrase it without sounding unwell. Hi, we think our dock might be rotating on its own overnight. Is that normal? It was not a sentence either of us could bring ourselves to say out loud to a stranger. I decided to document it. I told myself it was just for my own peace of mind, that if I had photos from consecutive mornings, I'd be able to prove to myself that this was some kind of optical thing, some trick of angle or memory, and the photos would show the dock hadn't actually moved at all. I took the first photo that morning, standing at the same spot in the yard, making sure to get the full length of the dock in frame along with a fixed point in the background. A large rock near the shoreline that wasn't going anywhere. I told myself I'd take one every morning at the same time from the same spot until I had enough to compare and put my own mind at ease. I want to tell you that the photos made me feel better. They didn't. That night, before bed, I sat on the porch, scrolling back through that first photo. Zooming in the way you do when you're looking for reassurance rather than information. The dock, the rock, the flat gray surface of the lake behind it, all exactly as I remembered seeing them. Except that when I zoomed in on the water just past the end of the dock, there was something in the frame I hadn't noticed while I was standing there taking the picture. It wasn't large. It wasn't obviously anything at all, really. Just a faint shape breaking the surface of the water. Low and still, easy to mistake for a shadow or a trick of the light on a still morning. But shadows don't usually have an outline that's straight. And they don't usually sit exactly where a person's shoulders would sit if someone were standing chest deep in the water, perfectly motionless, facing the shore. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept telling myself it was nothing, some artifact of the phone's camera compressing the image. A trick of light on water that only looked like a shape because I was already primed to look for one. I zoomed in until the picture broke apart into blur and pixels, and by the time I gave up, I genuinely couldn't tell you any more whether I was looking at a person, a log, or nothing at all. That uncertainty should have been comforting. It wasn't. I think what actually unsettled me was how badly I wanted it to be nothing, and how much effort it took to convince myself that it was. I didn't show Eric the photo that night. I told myself I'd wait until morning, when I had better light, when I wasn't tired and jumping at shadows on a screen at midnight. The next morning, I took the second photo. The dock had moved again. Further in the other direction this time. Angled now almost parallel to the shoreline instead of pointing out into open water or toward the neighboring property. I showed Eric both photos side by side. He looked at them for a long time, longer than I expected, and then he did the thing that people do when they're trying to protect their own sense of a normal, explainable world. He started building a theory. I wanted to believe him, I really did. But I'd stood on those boards myself, had felt how solid the posts were underfoot, no give at all, no wobble, nothing that suggested a structure capable of drifting. I didn't say that out loud, though. I let him have the theory, because the alternative was admitting neither of us actually had one. Over the next several mornings, I kept photographing it. The pattern that emerged wasn't random. Each morning, the angle had shifted a little further, always in the same rotational direction, like something slowly, patiently turning a dial. It wasn't snapping wildly from one direction to another. It was creeping, degree by degree. You could watch it happen like a slow, deliberate countdown. I started noticing something else around this time. Something I almost didn't mention to Eric because I was afraid of how it would sound. There were marks on the dock itself in the mornings. Wet patches on the boards. The kind of dark, damp footprint shapes that show up when someone walks somewhere barefoot after being in water. At first I assumed they were ours, left over from swimming the day before. Except the boards had been bone dry the night before I went to bed, and these marks were fresh enough that the wood around them hadn't fully absorbed the moisture yet. What bothered me most wasn't that they were there. It was the direction they went. Footprints from someone getting out of the water and walking up the dock toward the yard would face one way. These went the opposite direction. Wet marks that started near the yard end of the dock and grew fainter as they approached the water, like something had walked backward into the lake, or like something had come from the house and returned to where it came from. I photographed those too. I didn't show Eric that particular detail for 2 more days. When I finally did show him, he went quiet in a different way than before. Not dismissive, careful. He admitted something to me that night that he hadn't said out loud until then. He told me that for the past few nights, he'd been waking up around 2 or 3 in the morning to a sound he couldn't quite place. Not footsteps. Something rhythmic, wet, deliberate, like the sound of oars dipping into still water and pulling through it. Over and over, slow and even. The way you'd row if you were in absolutely no hurry to get anywhere. He said he'd gotten up the second night it happened and looked out the bedroom window toward the water. There was no boat out there. Nothing on the surface at all. Just the dock, sitting in whatever position it had rotated to that particular night, and the sound continuing steadily somewhere out past where he could see, like it was coming from a boat that simply wasn't there to be seen. I asked him why he hadn't told me sooner. He said the same reason I hadn't told him about the footprints. He didn't want to be the one who said it first. Something between us shifted. It wasn't relief exactly. It was more like we'd both been carrying the same weight separately, and now we were at least carrying it together, which somehow made it heavier and lighter at the same time. We didn't talk about leaving yet. I think neither of us wanted to be the one to suggest it first, the same way neither of us had wanted to be the one to admit what we'd seen and heard. The man behind the counter asked us the usual small talk questions. Where were we staying? I told him the address, the way you do without thinking, and something in his face changed. It wasn't dramatic, it was subtle, the kind of shift you'd miss if you weren't already primed to look for it. A slight tightening around his eyes. He said that was a nice house, good spot on the lake. Then he changed the subject to the weather forecast for the weekend, smooth enough that if I hadn't been watching for it, I would have thought nothing of it at all. I pushed, gently, the way you do when you're trying not to seem like you're pushing. I mentioned casually that the dock seemed to move around a bit more than we expected. I said it like a joke, like I was complaining about a minor inconvenience, current or wind or something equally mundane. He didn't laugh. He rang up our groceries a little faster than before, and as he handed me the receipt, he said, without quite looking at me, that the last folks who stayed out there left early, didn't finish out their summer. He said it like a fact, not a warning, and when I asked why, he said he didn't really know, that it wasn't his business, and that we should have a good rest of our stay. I wanted to ask more. Eric touched my arm, which was his way of telling me not to push further in a public place with a stranger who clearly didn't want to talk. That night, after Eric had gone to bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the phrase, left early. I went looking through the house for anything that might explain it, starting with the kitchen drawer where we'd found that generic guest book on our first day. I sat at the table and read through it properly for the first time. Most of the entries were exactly what you'd expect. Families thanking the owners, comments about the fishing, a few notes about raccoons getting into the trash. But near the back, on a page that looked slightly different from the others, slightly more worn, there was an entry that had no date, no signature, just a few lines in handwriting that looked rushed, pressed hard enough into the paper that you could feel the indentation from the page behind it. It said that the dock kept turning. and that they didn't know how to explain it to anyone who hadn't seen it themselves. It said something about the direction meaning something, though the writer didn't explain what. And then, at the bottom, in different ink, like it had been added later or by someone else entirely, there was a single line. It said, "We should have left the first night it faced the house." I sat with that for a long time. I want to be honest about what I felt reading it, because it wasn't just fear. It was something closer to recognition. The specific sick feeling of realizing you're not the first person this has happened to, and that whatever happened to them didn't end well enough for them to still be renting this house themselves. I kept searching. In a small desk in the corner of what was technically the third bedroom, the one we hadn't been using, I found a shoebox pushed to the back of a drawer, half hidden under a stack of old board games. Inside were a handful of letters, personal ones, addressed to a name I didn't recognize, postmarked from a few summers earlier. Most of the letters were unremarkable, family updates, nothing about the lake at all. But one of them, written partway through what looked like a summer stay at this exact house, described almost exactly what we'd been living through. The dock is turning a little further each morning. The wet marks on the boards. A sound at night like oars in water with no boat to match it. And then, near the end of that letter, the writer said that they'd started to realize the direction wasn't random, that the dock always ended up angled toward whatever part of the house someone in the family was currently sleeping in, as if it were slowly working out where they were. We had moved bedrooms twice since we arrived. I got up from that desk and walked straight to the bedroom window, the one in the room we were currently using, the room we'd chosen for no reason other than the light. I looked out at the dock. It was already angled directly at that window. I didn't sleep that night, not really. I lay next to Eric, who had drifted off despite everything, and I stared at the ceiling, doing the math on what I'd just read. The dock had been angled at our old bedroom before we switched rooms. Now it was angled at this one, or something out there genuinely was tracking which room we slept in, adjusting a little more each time we changed anything at all. Around 2 a.m, I heard it. The sound Eric had described. The slow, even rhythm of something moving through water with the patience of someone who had nowhere else to be. I lay perfectly still and listened to it for what felt like 10 minutes. It didn't speed up. It didn't stop. It just continued at that same unhurried pace, somewhere out past the edge of what I could see from the bed. I didn't wake Eric, because I think I was afraid that seeing fear on his face would make mine worse. In the morning, the wet marks on the dock had changed again. They weren't confined to the boards anymore. They continued up the little gravel path that led from the dock to the house, faint but visible if you knew to look for them, drying quickly in the morning sun but still damp enough near the porch steps to leave a shape. And for the first time, they didn't stop at the door. They went around the side of the house, along the exterior wall, directly beneath the window of the bedroom we were sleeping in. We followed the marks together, not saying much. The marks stopped directly under the window, just stopped. No continuation, no sign of where whatever made them had gone afterward. Just a damp patch in the dirt below the glass, roughly the width of 2 feet standing still for a long time. Eric wanted to call the property manager that day. I agreed, finally, and we did, though the conversation went about as well as you'd expect. She said the house had a long history of tenants. I asked her, as evenly as I could manage, whether previous tenants had ever mentioned anything similar. There was a pause on the line, but that if we wanted to end our stay early, a partial refund could be arranged. That offer, made so quickly and so easily, told me more than anything else she said. We didn't leave that day. I've asked myself many times since, why not? And the honest answer is complicated. And part of it, if I'm being fully honest, was curiosity. The specific, dangerous kind that convinces you that understanding a threat is the same thing as being safe from it. That night, we sat together on the porch instead of going to bed, both of us watching the water instead of pretending to sleep. Around 1 a.m, the rowing sound started again, faint at first, then steady. Eric grabbed the flashlight we kept by the door and swept it out across the water, slow, deliberate, covering as much of the surface as the beam would allow. There was nothing there. No boat, no ripples beyond the natural, small movement of water settling itself. The sound had stopped the moment the light hit the water, cutting off mid-rhythm, like something pausing rather than something simply ending on its own. We sat there a while longer, and I almost convinced myself it was over for the night. Then, out of the corner of my eye, not directly in front of me, but off to the side, near where the dock met the shoreline, just past the edge of the flashlight's reach, I saw it. A shape standing in the water, chest deep, motionless, facing the house. It was a silhouette, dark against the slightly lighter water around it. Except driftwood doesn't have shoulders, and it doesn't turn, slowly, deliberately, the moment you realize you're looking directly at it. By the time I grabbed Eric's arm and pointed, it was gone. Not swimming away, not making any sound of retreat at all. Just gone. Eric hadn't seen it. He believed me, I think, more than he would have a week earlier, but I sat there afterward with my heart still pounding, staring at that empty patch of water, and I understood something with total certainty for the first time since this had started. It wasn't circling the house at random. It was waiting for something. Night after night, degree by patient degree. I told Eric I wanted to stay up the whole night and watch, without the flashlight this time. He didn't love the idea. He'd already started quietly packing a bag that afternoon. We compromised. We didn't talk much once it got dark. Around midnight, the rowing sound started, right on schedule. I let my eyes adjust and just watched. And around 1 a.m, I watched the dock itself move for the first time, instead of just seeing the results the next day. It wasn't drifting. It was being adjusted, one small correction at a time. That's when I understood what was actually happening. It wasn't moving toward the house directly. It was waiting for the dock to finish each correction first. 2 nights, maybe 3 at the most. I turned to say it out loud to Eric. I didn't have to. His face told me he'd already done the same math, sitting 3 feet away from me, in silence. Neither of us said the number. Saying it would have made the decision unavoidable. Stay and be there when it finishes, or leave tonight and never know what it was finishing toward. It never changed. 2 nights, maybe 3. Once the sun was up, I went back to the shoebox, looking specifically for an ending this time. Near the bottom was a final letter, shorter than the others, the handwriting less steady. It read like something written to be found rather than sent. The writer said they'd finally understood what the dock was doing, even if they still didn't understand why. The letter said the years before. It wasn't one family's letters, it was several, layered across years. I looked at the dates. Years had passed since that letter was written. We weren't the first people this had happened to. We were just the newest ones, sitting exactly where the others had sat, doing the same math, facing the same choice. We had, at most, one night left. I looked out at the water, calm and ordinary in the afternoon light. Eric was already standing by the car, keys in hand, waiting to see what I'd decide. For a moment, I genuinely thought we'd get in the car and just go. That's not what happened. At least one family before us had left in time, and the pattern had simply reset, waiting for someone new. If we left, someone else would sit at that same table next summer and start the same countdown from zero. Leaving wouldn't end it. It would just hand it to someone else. I told Eric I wanted one more night, not out of curiosity anymore. I wanted to know if what happened at the moment of alignment could be survived. And if it couldn't, I wanted whoever found that shoebox next to have more than half a letter to go on. We packed the car anyway, fully, engine facing the driveway, ready to run if it came to that. We didn't sit on the porch that final night. We sat inside, at the window the dock had been angling toward for 2 weeks. Lights off. The rowing sound started earlier than usual, just after 11. I watched the dock this time, waiting for the last correction. It moved once, a single smooth rotation, and within 30 seconds it lined up in an unbroken line straight to our window. No angle left to close. The sound stopped immediately. The silence after it was worse than anything that came before. Then I saw it, standing at the very end of the dock instead of out in the water, closer than it had ever let itself be seen. Still just a silhouette, but facing our window directly, completely still. I found Eric's hand in the dark. Neither of us moved. It didn't come any closer. It stood there for what felt like a long time, then turned and walked back into the water, gone the same silent way it always was. The dock never moved again. We left 2 days later, in daylight, taking everything except the shoebox, which I put back exactly where I found it, along with a new letter of my own, so whoever found it next would have more to go on than we did. I don't know who's staying in that house this summer. I don't know if their dock has already started its own slow turn toward wherever they happen to be sleeping. What I do know is that somewhere on that lake, there's a dock that isn't finished with what it does. It only resets. New house, new family. Someone mentioning over coffee that it's strange they could have sworn it faced a different way yesterday. And if you ever rent a lake house and notice the dock facing a slightly different direction than it did the morning before, do one simple thing before you convince yourself it's nothing. Check the drawers. All of them. There's probably a box waiting to tell you exactly how much time you actually have left.